From CGTN headquarters in Beijing, this is The Hub with Wang Guan.
You're watching The Hub on CGTN. The United Nations has just publicized its World Economic Situation and Projects 2022 report. Last year, the global output expanded by 5.5%, but it is projected to slow down to just 4% in 2022 and 3.5% in 2023. The report said that the global economic recovery is facing significant headwinds amidst the new waves of COVID-19 infections, persistent labor market challenges, lingering supply chain bottlenecks, and rising inflationary pressures. As the world's top two economic giants, China and the United States, have a significant say on the global economy, and the relations between them really matter to the future of the world, to put it mildly. And how will Beijing-Washington complexity shape the long-term economic landscape? Is the situation getting worse, or we can still anticipate a peaceful and a prosperous world? Now, I'm honored to be joined today by Mr. Adam S. Posen in Washington, D.C. He's the president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Sir, it is an honor for us to have you with us at this hour. Welcome to CGTN. Recently, you talked about U.S.-led corrosion of globalization and its effect on the global growth. According to the World Bank, global growth will slow through 2023, adding to a risk of so-called hard landing in developing economies. How can the world, really counter this trend and navigate through these pitfalls?
It's going to be difficult. The biggest thing the rich world, which I include China and the U.S. now for this purpose, can do is provide vaccines and health distribution of those throughout the world. The second biggest thing is to run their economies as open as they can. This is where the U.S. has been corroding globalization most. It has been excluding trade and immigration to a very high degree, continuing to move backwards after President Trump, under President Biden. The Chinese economy also has to be willing to take in imports, but they do much more of that, frankly, on balance than the U.S.
Now, talking about globalization, actually, you said what's really going on is regionalization because of COVID to a large extent, and among other things. And you argued recently, Mr. Posen, that the U.S. retreat from international economic policymaking and the fallout from the COVID pandemic could lead to greater regionalization of products and services, divergent standards, and reduced labor mobility across borders, among many other challenges. How do you think we can still reverse this trend, or help mitigate the negative impact of this trend?
Thank you for reading my recent work, and it is a depressing trend to look at. I think the divergence coming between the U.S. and China, people have talked about it for a long time. Some people have talked about decoupling. That's not going to happen in full, but there is definitely some gap between the U.S. and China business networks, intellectual property standards, technological standards, human interactions that is growing. So I think the most important things we can do are, first, let the US and China together agree that the rest of the world should not have to choose sides. Let the rest of the world get the benefits of interaction with both, and that we should be encouraging the rest of the world to stand up strongly for itself, whether that's CPTPP or the European Union. We need to have other strong players besides China and the US. The final thing is that the US and China should be trying to work together on certain global public goods. We have seen some progress on nuclear safety. We have seen a little progress on decarbonization. But to go back to your initial point, for short-term growth in the developing world, we need a lot more aid and a lot less debt.
Well, yeah, Mr. Posen, you talk about the fact that there needs to be a greater China-U.S. collaboration. But do you think President Joe Biden has the political space to do that when you think about, the stalled infrastructure plan, thanks to Senator Manchin, the Voting Bill Act, his historically low supporting approval ratings, according to multiple polls, and then the midterm elections coming up later this year. Also, there are politics here in China. I'm not going to lie. So, do you think President Joe Biden and the two sides really have the political space to do the right thing?
I think they have constraints, as you rightly point out, and they are on both sides. There are nationalist or isolationist people worrying about self-reliance, people worrying about an enemy economy in both countries. I think the way forward is twofold. First, the US and China, and I think President Xi and President Biden see this, need to pick a few issues that are either not so sensitive or which people understand are for the good of the world. Obviously, climate change is the biggest one. Making sure that there's good relationships over emergencies and no misunderstandings on military is another one. Economically, we have a successful regime in the central banking exchange rate sphere. The conflicts over yuan dollar that we had a decade ago have largely gone away because of concerted efforts. So I think picking a few areas to work on is the way forward. The second thing is to recognize that trade gets a lot of the political sensitivity, but investment, cross-border, and technological exchange are the bigger, more important things. And we need to work on ways that we can trust each other on investment and technology.
Yeah, but many would argue that here said than done, given all the political constraints. Let's talk about the Biden presidency. U.S. President Joe Biden has finished his first year in office amid, Omicron. To paraphrase Dickens, we could say this is the best of times and this is the worst of times. Because on the positive side, we look at the economics, the 6.4 jobs have been added in the U.S. Consumer demand is strong, wages are up, and the stock market is thriving. If you look at S&P 500 last year, gaining some 20 to 30%, which is very high. But inflation climbed to 7% in 2021, and supply chain challenges are very obvious as we know it. As an economist, would you say the glass is half empty or half full about the U.S. economy?
I'd say it's more than half full right now. The inflation will be dealt with. It needs to be dealt with because it's no longer just about bottlenecks or short supply. When you come back, it's now a more general inflation trend. So it has to be the Federal Reserve tightening policy to deal with it. And I think that makes inflation makes President Biden much more unpopular than he otherwise would be. I think the state of the US economy going forward, like the state of the Chinese economy going forward, is pretty strong and robust. There are inequality issues that have to be taken on, but the broad stability is possible. What is sad in both US and China is that our productivity trends are down. We're not getting as much out of our technology and investment or our workers as we should be. And that's in both sides made worse by the US-China conflict.
Right. Really, productivity gains are everything. And why do you think productivity gains are not there for both countries?
I think this is a place where we have different things going on. Part of it is there is a global sort of slowdown in technology at the frontier. The OECD has done work on this, the IMF, the Peterson Institute, which I lead, has done work on this. And it's very clear that across the rich countries and across the high-tech accessing countries, which includes China, there was just a slowdown about 15 years ago. And we're just not seeing the pace of innovation, or for that matter, innovation getting adopted across the economy the way it was, say, in the 90s. So that's something that we don't know how to fix. We just have to keep investing in R&D, in good intellectual property, in good human training, and hope that it comes back. The other path is different from US to China. In the US, our problem is we're really bad at making use of our workers. There are a lot of women who are out of the workforce. There are a lot of people who, if they don't get a university education, don't get a very good education. We're not as good as we should be on training skilled labor, meaning what we call the trades, be it plumbing or construction or machine tooling. In China, the other thing that's going on is that a lot more money has in recent years been going into the state-owned enterprise sector and away from the private sector. And as my colleague Nicholas Lardy at Peterson has documented along with other people, that is lowering the returns on capital in China. Now, in both the US and China, the government can make a decision. There are more important things than economic productivity. So in China, it may be important to reassert the state and say we need more of the state-owned enterprise, but you have to accept that there is an economic cost to doing it.
So President Posen, I'm really also curious about your take on Build Back Better plan with the infrastructure plan at the center of it all, because from the Chinese point of view, infrastructure is crucially important. But I know this is a very touchy and sensitive issue in Washington. As an economist, what's your view on this plan? Do you think it is the right thing to do to boost the infrastructure of the United States?
The need for an improved physical infrastructure in the US, particularly in the energy grid, in the transportation sector, and adapting to climate change as well, is very real. And anybody who's visited China in recent years or just seen the footage on CGTN can see how much better a lot of physical infrastructure, government infrastructure, is in China than in the US right now. So actually, the physical infrastructure bill did get passed with a majority from both parties, and that's going to go forward. It's nowhere near as big as I would like to see, given how low interest rates are and how big the needs are, but that's happening. The Build Back Better bill, which the president has put forward, is much more about broader definitions of infrastructure. So things like investing in childcare and community colleges, which are important to getting more out of women in the workforce and allowing more flexibility. There are many good aspects of Build Back Better that I would support and which I think could improve us quite a bit, but there's a lot of opposition once you get past physical infrastructure, and that's why it hasn't passed yet.
Right, let's talk about inflation. Joe Biden said soaring prices will be a transitory phenomenon brought about by supply chain issues. However, the prices of goods and services in the U.S. have continued to rise at rates unseen in decades. Will we see a tightening of quantitative easing and a rise in interest rates? How should the Fed address this question?
Well, I and some of my Peterson Institute colleagues a year ago were forecasting that inflation would last longer and be higher than either the Fed or Reserve or the Biden administration were saying. We took no pleasure in it, but that was the reality. And so when we look at what's going on now, it isn't just that we had these supply chain issues or people spending so much once they got the economy reopened and the economy couldn't react. Those were indeed transitory, but they take longer, and workers had to readjust. There were pushes for higher wages, pushes for different job conditions, and that takes time. That takes a couple of years to adjust. So nothing's going to make inflation go away overnight, but the Federal Reserve does have to tighten its monetary policy in order to get the general trend down once we're through all these transitory factors. That means that they're going to be tightening on the quantity side, and much more importantly, they'll be raising interest rates starting in March or April.
Right. Let's talk about the global recovery. Everybody's talking about a post-pandemic recovery. The WEF Chief Klaus Schwab goes further and calls for a great reset. What sort of recovery are you expecting, and what shall this great reset look like?
I don't know anything about any great reset, but what I do know is that, as you cited in the UN forecasts and the World Bank forecasts, we know that it is likely the economy will grow much less quickly in 2022 than it did last year, and still less quickly than that in 2023. And this is largely because you're not bouncing back from the very low levels we had versus 2020, and partly because we did such extraordinary stimulus across the world, not just in China and the US, during this past year. So growth had to come down. What's sad is, as we said at the start, that growth is so uneven. The US and China are going to do fine. China will have to continue its stimulating now, as the People's Bank has begun to do. The US has to measure its amount of monetary tightening, but they and Japan and Europe and the other rich economies will do fine. It is the developing world that is dragging down growth, and that's not entirely their fault. In fact, it's not mostly their fault. And so if you want to have reset, it has to be somehow sharing the wealth from north to south.
Finally, let's talk about COVID. COVID brought growth to a standstill in the UK and the EU and pretty much everywhere else. The geopolitical wrangling is likely to create flashpoints in Eastern Europe and the Indo-Pacific, according to many estimates. If you could read the tea leaves, what possible economic trends would you forecast?
I think the ones that I would most emphasize are first what we've already talked about, the growing divergence between US and China on non-trade issues and how that spills over. The second trend is going to be how much we get different changes in behavior around energy. As everyone knows, we've had to make changes and pledges to cut back. And so what will happen with coal, natural gas, and their use over the next couple of years. And the third, as you mentioned, tea leaves, I cannot judge the security problems. I am not an expert in those. One generally has to notice, though, that in economic history since World War II, the security issues generally don't have a lasting impact on economic growth because we've broadly had peace, and I hope that will continue.
All right, thanks so much for your insight. We have with us Mr. Adam S. Posen, President of the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Sir, thank you so much for your insight. Come back again, please.
Thank you for having me on CGTN.
You are watching The Hub. In the next segment, Wang Guan also talks to Gideon Rachman, Chief Foreign Affairs commentator at the Financial Times.
The United States can or should bring about in China that any internal political development in China is really going to be driven by forces within China and decided by the Chinese. Clearly, if you look at pure trade, China now is a more important trading partner for many more countries than the United States.
In your first book, ZeroSum World, in 2010, you predicted that the financial and economic crisis that began in 2008 would lead to a zero-sum world characterized by increasing tensions between the world's major powers. Looking back, how do you look at your own prediction, and do you think COVID-19 pandemic has in any ways affected that process?
Yeah, I think I got it basically right, to be honest. I mean, I was slightly annoyed with myself in retrospect for not being stronger in my predictions because at the time, the financial crisis had just happened and you were sort of guessing about how things were going to develop. But the argument of the book was that we had believed, particularly in the West, but elements of it were adopted also in China, that globalization would solve international conflict by creating a win-win situation. And that's a phrase you still hear a lot in China, in which there was a kind of economic and political system that all countries could buy into and that they would all be happy with. And that I thought that the way that, particularly in the West, we would think about globalization would change substantially in the aftermath of the financial crisis, and that it became clear that the economic benefits of globalization were not all as advertised, that there were lots of people who were suffering from, or at least felt that globalization had caused their living standards not to rise, but to lower, and that would lead to the rise of populist politics. And I think we've definitely seen that happen. As for the pandemic, that I think is a further blow to globalization. It's perhaps one that we may recover from, but really as much for practical reasons as ideological reasons.
So you just said, Mr. Rachman, that you wished your prediction could have been stronger about this zero-sum world. But don't you think this zero-sum mentality is the least thing that we want? If you look at climate change, the COVID-19 pandemic that is spiraling out of control and out of borders, geopolitical rivalry that is hurting more people than it's helping, this realist school of line of thinking. that many scholars would argue that we should get rid of or get less of as soon as possible.
I was simply saying that this is what I think will happen, and I think it did happen. But I think that simply saying, oh, well, this is a bad thing and we wish it didn't happen, it probably isn't enough. You need to try to analyze what's gone wrong and how can we get back to a more cooperative spirit. There are clearly some issues where there is cooperation is indispensable. You mentioned one of them, climate change. And I think that can be the basis for working together. I think that some in the West have noticed and been very pleased by China's commitment to get to net zero and want more details on that, but see that as a very positive move. So those kinds of things are very helpful. But I think that the geopolitical stuff is very, very hard to wish away because it's very entrenched in the way that both China and the US see the world. On a bipartisan basis. There is a kind of regime change school in the West, but I think it was probably stronger in the Trump administration. I think and I hope that the Biden people understand that that's really not something that the United States can or should bring about in China, that any internal political development of China is really going to be driven by forces within China and decided by the Chinese. So I think that they see their pushback as really focusing on territorial disputes and Chinese influence, so that they will seek to support India, for example, in the argument over the Indian border, to continue to patrol in the South China Sea. You can see that they're increasing support for Taiwan, and I think that's going to be a continuity with the Trump administration. And I can't really see that changing because it's kind of integral to how they see the world. And equally, I think in the current mood in Beijing, and probably any mood that I can conceive of, I don't see China taking a step back on these issues. I've heard so many times from Chinese scholars and officials that Taiwan is a core international interest, that there can be absolutely no compromise on that, and that China's position on various territorial disputes, whether it's the South China Sea or the Indian border, is well established and is unlikely to change. I don't see any compromise coming out of Beijing. So these conflicts, I think, on geopolitical issues are sort of baked into both the ideology and the power politics and are hard to get around.
All right, in your book, Easternization, you talk about this coming century being the Asian century. Of course, in the Western media, the commentators, pundits gave us enough opinions of their own, suggesting that it could be a bad thing. Are there good aspects if and when we're in a century of Asia where there's Easternization of the world?
Yes, of course that there are, because everybody, whether they're Asian, European, whatever, is a human being, and one of the aspects of Easternization is a rapid rise in wealth in Asia and huge opportunities for people to live a better life that they might not have had before. A friend of mine who said that, he's lived through this period where China's gone from relative poverty to being essentially a middle-class society in the big cities, at least, and saying that he felt that when he first visited Europe, that the living standards he saw there, that maybe by the end of his life, China would be the same. And he said, in fact, it happened in 10 years' time. Within 10 years, the living standards that he had seen as a student in the UK were there in Asia. And that is an amazing thing, that people can have that opportunity, and not just for Chinese people, because as we were suggesting, the biggest market for Western companies in future is likely to be China or Asia more broadly, and so that the wealth is shared to some extent. I think it also creates some challenges, the geopolitical ones we've talked about, and managing that is really the central political problem of our era. I'm not totally confident we'll do it, incidentally. I think that it's a very hard adjustment for everybody to go from a period of one superpower dominance to a challenger power. And as scholars who are much more distinguished than me have written about it, people like Graham Allison, that has resulted in war in the past. So that's difficult as a challenge. And then there's also the environmental issues, because a world in which the whole world is middle class is much higher consumer of energy, of food, and that clearly creates strains on the planet, which we can all see, and we can all say we have to manage these together, but seeing the problem, saying we should manage it together, and actually doing it are different.
The new Secretary of State, Janet Yellen, the new Treasury Secretary, talking about this complicated relationship, saying that there are cooperative as well as adversarial aspects in the relations with China. Where do you see U.S.-China relations going forward?
Well, I think it's the single most important issue facing the world, because these are the two great powers of the world now. So it's very important for everybody that they manage their relationship. I think that they will become less unpredictable on a day-to-day basis. There'll be much more consistency of tone from the Biden administration. And I think that there will be more emphasis on some areas where the two countries can work together. We've talked about one of them, particularly climate. I think that they probably will seek to come to some sort of trade deal, although I think it's a difficult one for them. And I think that reflects the fact that some of the changes that Trump has brought in will persist, that the United States is concerned about the implications for America's position in the world of the rise of China. And so I think that element of confrontation that Trump didn't introduce, but he accentuated it, will remain. But I think that they're going to try to be more focused and more strategic about it. And I think they're going to try and bring in allies.
You said once that a large part of America's emerging struggle with China will be a battle for economic influence around the world, and America's disarray is China's opportunity. How do you see this economic battle evolve going forward?
Well, it's very, very multifaceted. But I think that clearly, if you look at pure trade, China now is a more important trading partner for many more countries than the United States, and particularly in Asia. I think that is problematic for the United States. However, there are other aspects to it where the US is stronger. There are certain key technologies. We've seen this, for example, with semiconductor bans and so on, where the United States is ahead and has used that as a weapon at times, for example, by imposing semiconductor export bans. Biggest struggle really, though, and the one where nobody in the world, China included, yet has a response, is the role of the dollar in the global financial system. It is the world's global reserve currency. And that gives America enormous power to impose financial sanctions.
Gideon Rachman, Chief Foreign Affairs Commentator for the Financial Times. Thank you so much, sir, for your time and your insight.